Chapter 1. The Gilded Prison of Privilege. Born Maria Nikolaevna O'Rourke in 1877 into Polish-Russian aristocracy, Marie Tarnowska entered the world wrapped in silk and suffocated by expectations. Her father, Count Nikolai O'Rourke, possessed vast estates and an ancient lineage, while her mother embodied the fragile beauty expected of aristocratic women. Marie's childhood unfolded in the opulent palaces of St. Petersburg and Polish estates, where her extraordinary beauty became both blessing and curse. From an early age, she learned that her violet eyes and porcelain features were commodities to be traded for family advancement. The chapter establishes the paradox of her existence: unlimited material wealth, paired with complete emotional poverty. Her education consisted not just of languages and arts, but of the subtle manipulation required to navigate high society. As she approaches her debut into society, the cracks in this gilded world become apparent. Her father's gambling debts mount, her mother retreats into laudanum-induced stupors, and Marie begins to understand that even in palaces, survival requires cunning. The tone is opulent yet foreboding, introducing the suffocating weight of legacy and the dangerous allure of using beauty as a weapon. This foundation sets the stage for her transformation from protected heiress to calculating predator. The chandeliers of the Winter Palace cast rainbow prisms across the assembled nobility, transforming the ballroom into a constellation of silk, diamonds, and barely contained ambition. Among the swirling gowns and military uniforms moved 17-year-old Maria O'Rourke, her debut into society marking not just her coming of age, but her entry into a world where beauty was currency and marriage was merger. Marie possessed the kind of beauty that stopped conversations mid-sentence. Her violet blue eyes held depths that promised everything while revealing nothing, and her dark hair caught the light like spun silk. She had been born into this world of excess, the daughter of Count Nikolai O'Rourke, whose Polish estates and Russian connections had built a fortune spanning 2 empires. Yet beneath the glittering surface of her privileged existence lay a suffocating truth. She was not a person, but a possession, carefully cultivated for eventual sale to the highest bidder. The O'Rourke mansion on Nevsky Prospect stood as a monument to inherited wealth. 37 rooms filled with French furniture, Italian marble, and the accumulated treasures of generations. Marie had grown up breathing air perfumed with beeswax and imported lilacs, her footsteps echoing through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose blood ran in her veins like liquid gold. But gold, she had learned, could be as binding as iron chains. Her father found her near the refreshment table, his face flushed with champagne and the artificial joviality of a man hiding mounting debts. Count Nikolai retained his handsome features at 50, but dissolution had begun to blur the sharp edges of his Irish-Russian aristocracy. He placed a possessive hand on her shoulder, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne failing to mask the smell of desperation. "My beautiful daughter," he murmured, his words slightly thick with wine. "Every man in this room is watching you. Do you see how they look? Like starving wolves." His grip tightened. "You will marry brilliantly, won't you, Maria? Restore our family's position, secure our future?" Marie studied the faces around them through her fan, recognizing the hunger in their eyes. These men didn't see her, they saw an acquisition. A prize to be won, displayed, possessed. "Of course, Papa," she replied, her voice carrying a calmness that surprised even her. "I understand my duty." But even as she spoke these expected words, something cold and calculating stirred within her. If she was to be sold, perhaps she could choose her own price. If her beauty was a weapon, why shouldn't she learn to wield it? The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Prince Andrei Volkonsky approached with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his desires fulfilled. At 43, married with children, he represented everything her world expected her to accept: older, wealthy, powerful, and utterly transparent in his intentions. As he led her onto the dance floor, Marie felt his hand tremble slightly against her waist. sensed his quickened breathing as she allowed herself to lean closer for just a moment before pulling away with practiced innocence. "You dance divinely, Countess," the prince breathed, his eyes never leaving her face, like an angel descended from heaven. "Angels," Marie replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "can be quite dangerous, Your Excellency. They carry swords as well as harps." The prince laughed, missing the warning in her words, seeing only the beautiful young woman who would make such a delightful mistress. He would send flowers tomorrow, perhaps a bracelet. They always did. But as the waltz continued, Marie was already calculating. How much was his desire worth? What could she extract from his need to possess her? Later, escaping to the palace terrace for air, she encountered her reflection in the tall windows. The girl looking back was stunning, yes, but Marie saw something else in those violet eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there that morning. The innocent debutante was already dying, replaced by something far more dangerous. The night air carried the scent of the Neva River and the distant sound of church bells marking midnight. As if summoned by the bells, a young officer emerged from the shadows. Captain Vasily Tarnowski was handsome in a reckless way, with dark eyes that held promises of passion and destruction in equal measure. "The most beautiful woman in Russia hides in the shadows," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery that intrigued her. "Are you afraid of your own power, little countess?" "I'm not afraid," Marie replied, turning to face him fully. "I'm learning." "And what are you learning?" Vasily asked, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell brandy and danger on his breath. Marie looked at him, really looked, and saw not another predator, but a potential ally. Someone who understood that beauty was a game, and games were meant to be won. "I'm learning," she said softly, "that in a world of hunters, the prey who survives is the one who learns to hunt back." The moon hung full and cold over St. Petersburg, indifferent to the tragedy that had just begun to unfold. In that moment, on that terrace, the Black Angel was born, not from evil, but from the terrible clarity that comes when a trapped creature finally understands the nature of its cage and begins to plan its escape. Chapter 2. The Marriage Trap and First Lessons in Power. Marie's marriage to Captain Vasily Tarnowski in 1896 appears to offer escape from her father's financial pressures, but quickly becomes another form of imprisonment. Vasily, initially charming and passionate, reveals himself as a jealous, violent man who views his beautiful wife as property to be controlled and displayed. The couple moves between European capitals, Vienna, Venice, Paris, living on credit and Vasily's military connections, while their relationship deteriorates into mutual contempt. Marie gives birth to 2 children, Tioka and Pavel, but motherhood only deepens her sense of entrapment. To cope with a difficult childbirth and Vasily's increasing cruelty, she is introduced to morphine by a doctor, beginning a dependency that will haunt her for years. The drug provides not just physical relief, but emotional numbness, allowing her to endure her husband's infidelities and violence. More importantly, the morphine grants her a cold clarity that transforms her from victim to strategist. She begins to understand that her suffering can be weaponized, that men's guilt and desire make them vulnerable to manipulation. The chapter ends with Marie's chilling realization that she can control even Vasily through calculated displays of fragility and strength. Her transformation from innocent bride to calculating manipulator accelerates as she discovers that in her world, only the ruthless survive. The wedding had been magnificent, a spectacle of white roses and Venetian lace that masked the desperation driving the union. Marie stood beside Captain Vasily Tarnowski in the cathedral, her face a perfect mask of bridal serenity, while inside she calculated the dimensions of her new cage. At 19, she had traded her father's mounting debts for a husband's expectations, believing marriage might offer freedom. Instead, she discovered that Vasily's charm was a performance as calculated as her own. The Tarnowski estate sprawled across hundreds of acres of Polish countryside, a Baroque palace that should have been beautiful but felt like exile. Vasily expected her to play the devoted wife, manage his household, entertain his tedious military friends, produce heirs to carry on his ancient name. She fulfilled these duties with mechanical precision while her mind ranged elsewhere, plotting survival strategies she didn't yet fully understand. The children came quickly. First Tioka in 1897, then Pavel the following year. The births were brutal affairs that nearly killed her, and recovery was complicated by Vasily's impatience with her weakness. The doctor, a discreet man with kind eyes, prescribed morphine for the pain. Just temporarily, he assured her, until you regain your strength. But Marie discovered that morphine did more than ease physical agony. It provided emotional anesthesia that allowed her to endure Vasily's increasingly erratic behavior. He drank heavily, gambled compulsively, and maintained a series of mistresses with barely concealed indiscretion. When she confronted him about his infidelities, his response was swift and violent. The first time he struck her, Marie was so shocked she simply stood there, hand pressed to her burning cheek. The second time, she began to plan. The third time, she understood that violence was simply another form of communication in their marriage, and she could learn to speak that language fluently. On this particular Thursday evening, Vasily returned from Vienna in a rage. His latest gambling losses had been substantial, and his mistress had publicly humiliated him at a reception. He found Marie in the nursery, reading to their children before bed, and his fury found its target. Still playing the devoted mother? He sneered, his uniform disheveled, brandy thick on his breath. While your husband's reputation is destroyed by debts you helped create with your extravagant demands? Marie looked up from the book, her expression serene despite the morphine coursing through her veins. The drug had taught her to observe rather than react, to calculate rather than feel. My demands? She asked quietly. I asked for nothing but fidelity and respect. Apparently, those were the most expensive commodities of all. Vasily's face darkened. He dismissed the governess with a sharp gesture and waited until they were alone before grabbing Marie's wrist, twisting until she gasped. Don't play word games with me. You know exactly what you cost me, the dowry I never received, the connections your father promised that never materialized, the social advancement that turned to social embarrassment. Marie studied his face, noting the desperation beneath the anger. Vasily needed her beauty to validate his status, her presence to distract from his failures. In that moment of clarity, she understood the true nature of her power. Let me go, Vasily, she said, her voice carrying a new quality, not pleading but commanding. When he didn't immediately comply, she smiled, and something in that smile made him release her instinctively. You're quite right, I have been expensive, but consider what you've purchased. She stood gracefully, smoothing her silk dress with hands that no longer trembled. The morphine had taught her to perform even pain, to weaponize even weakness. Every man at court watches me, she continued, circling him slowly. Every woman envies you. Your fellow officers speak of your good fortune in securing such a prize. But prizes can be lost, Vasily. They can be stolen, sold, or simply given away. She saw the fear flicker in his eyes and pressed her advantage. You think you own me because you married me? You own nothing but a reflection of yourself, and reflections can be very unflattering when the light changes. Vasily stared at her, recognizing something new and dangerous in his wife. The innocent girl he had married was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that survival required transformation. She had learned to alchemize suffering into strength, to transmute vulnerability into victory. What do you want? He asked, his voice smaller now, uncertain. Marie smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes, cold, calculating, beautiful. I want you to remember that I chose to stay. Every day I choose to remain your wife, to bear your name, to reflect your status. But choices can change, my dear husband. They can change very quickly." She kissed his cheek with theatrical tenderness, then swept from the room, leaving him standing alone among their children's toys. As she walked down the corridor toward her private chambers, Marie felt a new sensation, not happiness exactly, but something like satisfaction. She had discovered that power wasn't something one was born with or married into. Power was something one took, piece by careful piece, until the cage became a throne. The morphine sang in her veins, promising relief from conscience as well as pain. Outside, the Polish countryside stretched endlessly under a starless sky, but Marie no longer felt trapped. She was learning to be the hunter rather than the hunted, and the lesson was intoxicating. Chapter 3: The Venetian Web and the First Step. By 1902, Marie's marriage has completely deteriorated, and she flees to Venice with her children, ostensibly for their health, but actually to escape Vasili's increasing violence. Venice becomes her hunting ground, where she perfects the art of emotional manipulation while living on credit and the generosity of infatuated men. She meets two crucial figures, Count Pavel Komarovsky, a wealthy Russian engineer, and Donat Prilukov, a young attorney who becomes obsessively devoted to her. Marie orchestrates an elaborate scheme, convincing Prilukov that Komarovsky is abusing her and threatening her life. The morphine addiction that began as medical necessity has become psychological armor, allowing her to view human relationships as chess games where emotions are merely pieces to be moved. She systematically destroys the friendship between the two men, feeding Prilukov's jealousy while extracting money from Komarovsky's genuine affection. The crisis erupts when Prilukov, driven to madness by Marie's calculated manipulations, murders Komarovsky in a Venice hotel. The scandal explodes across European society, with Marie cast as the Black Angel who bewitches men into murder. Though she maintains her innocence, claiming to be another victim of male violence, the pattern of destruction following her becomes impossible to ignore. The chapter ends with her arrest and the terrible realization that she has finally overplayed her hand. Venice had welcomed Marie like a city built for secrets, its winding canals and shadowed palazzos offering both glamour and anonymity. She had arrived 6 months earlier with her children, claiming the Italian air would benefit their health, but truly fleeing the suffocating violence of her marriage to Vasily. The city of water and light became her stage, where she could reinvent herself as the tragic young countess, separated from her husband, struggling to raise her children alone. The performance was masterful. Marie had learned to weaponize her vulnerability, to make her beauty seem fragile rather than threatening. Men stopped in the street to stare. Women whispered behind their fans, torn between envy and sympathy. She took rooms at a respectable pension near San Marco, living on credit and the increasingly generous gifts of admirers who believed they were rescuing a damsel in distress. Count Pavel Komarovsky entered her life at a reception hosted by the Russian consul. He was 52, wealthy from engineering contracts across the empire, and desperately lonely since his wife's death 2 years prior. When he saw Marie standing by the window overlooking the Grand Canal, evening light turning her dark hair to spun gold, he felt something he thought had died with his beloved wife: hope for companionship, for love. Marie recognized his vulnerability immediately. She had developed an instinct for wounded hearts, could sense emotional need the way predators sense blood. She allowed Komarovsky to court her properly, afternoon walks along the canals, evenings at La Fenice Opera House, careful conversations about art and literature. She played the role of the reluctant widow, still healing from her husband's cruelty, grateful for Komarovsky's patience and gentleness. The seduction was methodical. Komarovsky didn't want a mistress, he wanted a wife, a companion to fill the emptiness in his comfortable life. Marie became that dream, or at least the illusion of it. She listened to his stories about his late wife with apparent empathy, accompanied him to concerts with perfect propriety, allowed him to hold her gloved hand while maintaining just enough distance to drive him to distraction. After 6 weeks of careful courtship, Komarovsky proposed. Marie accepted with tears of apparent joy, but with conditions that revealed her true nature. She needed time to finalize her divorce from Vasily, she explained with pretty embarrassment. She needed financial assistance, she admitted reluctantly, because her husband had cut off her allowance. Komarovsky was only too happy to help, providing generous monthly support and paying off various debts she claimed to have accumulated. But Marie had no intention of marrying Komarovsky. The very idea repelled her. Another cage, another set of expectations, another man who would eventually reveal his true nature once he possessed her completely. What she needed was a way to extract his wealth without the burden of marriage, and for that, she required assistance. Donat Prilikov had followed her from their previous encounter in St. Petersburg, abandoning his promising legal career for the chance to be near her. The young attorney was handsome in a delicate way, passionate, and utterly devoted. Marie had been cultivating his obsession for months, feeding him just enough hope to keep him desperate, never enough satisfaction to make him complacent. She arranged to meet Prilikov in a small cafe near the Academia Bridge on a gray September afternoon. He arrived early, his face lighting up when he saw her, hands trembling as he helped her to her seat. Marie had prepared carefully for this performance, applying subtle cosmetics to create the illusion of bruises, practicing the exact tone of voice that would convey fear without seeming theatrical. "Donat," she began, her voice breaking slightly, "I cannot continue like this. Komarovsky grows more possessive each day. He threatens me, follows me, demands things I cannot give. Yesterday She gestured vaguely at her throat where she had created the faint impression of finger marks. It was a complete fabrication. Komarovsky was gentle, respectful, almost pathetically grateful for any attention she gave him. But Prilikov, who had never met the Count personally, had no way of knowing this. His face flushed with rage at the sight of her apparent injuries. "I will protect you," Prilikov declared immediately, reaching across the table to take her hands. "Tell me what you need. I will do anything." Over the following weeks, Marie carefully constructed a narrative of escalating abuse and terror. She showed Prilikov additional bruises she had inflicted on herself, claiming Komarovsky had caused them during violent rages. She wept in his arms, telling him that the Count had threatened to kill her if she tried to leave him, that she lived in constant fear for her life and the safety of her children. Prilikov, young and romantic and completely under her spell, believed every word. The morphine that now flowed regularly through Marie's veins had taught her to observe human weakness with scientific precision. She could see exactly how to push Prilikov's protective instincts, his jealousy, his desperate need to be her hero. "Sometimes," she whispered during one of their clandestine meetings, "I think the only way I will ever be free is if he were dead." She said the word not with malice, but with wistful longing, as if death were a warm blanket rather than an ending. Prilikov stared at her, seeing not a manipulator, but a trapped angel begging for salvation. "Don't say that," he gasped, though the seed was already planted and growing. "Why not?" Marie snapped, dropping her facade for just a moment to reveal the steel beneath. "Is his life worth more than my soul? He treats me like property, Donat. He laughs at your devotion to me, calls you a foolish boy playing at being a man." The insult struck its target perfectly. Prilikov's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "He said that?" "He says worse," Marie lied smoothly, leaning forward to place her hand over his heart. "But I know the truth. I know you are a knight, my knight. If you truly love me, you will save me from him." On the night of September 4th, the plan reached its inevitable conclusion. Marie had arranged to meet Komarovsky at the Hotel Luna, promising him the intimacy he had been patiently waiting for. Prilikov would be waiting in the bedroom, hidden, ready to act when the moment came. Marie arrived at 9 o'clock, dressed in dark silk that made her look like a beautiful widow. Komarovsky greeted her with joy, with relief, with the desperate gratitude of a lonely man who believed his solitude was finally ending. She let him pour wine, let him sit beside her on the sofa, let him speak of their future together with touching sincerity. When Komarovsky leaned in to kiss her, Marie stood abruptly, walking toward the bedroom with apparent nervousness. He followed eagerly, unsuspecting, trusting. Prilikov emerged from behind the door, a revolver trembling in his hand. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a terrible tableau. The victim, the weapon, the architect of destruction. Komarovsky understood in that instant. Marie saw the comprehension dawn in his kind eyes, saw him look at her with something beyond fear, profound sadness. He knew he had been betrayed by the woman he loved, that his death had been orchestrated by the very person he had tried to protect and cherish. "Marie," he said softly, his voice carrying no anger, only heartbreak. "Why?" She didn't answer. Prilikov fired 3 times, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Komarovsky fell, blood spreading across the expensive carpet, and Marie watched him die with the same detached curiosity she might have given to an insect. They fled separately into the Venetian night. Marie returned to her pension and slept soundly, the morphine ensuring her dreams remained undisturbed. Prilikov wandered the canals until dawn, his mind unable to process what he had done in the name of love. The body was discovered the next morning. Within days, both Marie and Prilikov were in custody. The investigation was swift and thorough, the scandal immediate and international. Newspapers across Europe called her the Black Angel, a vampiric seductress who fed on the souls of men. But as Marie sat in her Venetian cell awaiting trial, she felt only a cold satisfaction. Komarovsky had served his purpose, Prilikov had served his. If the world wanted to cast her as a monster, so be it. Monsters, at least, were never victims. Chapter 4: The Trial of the Black Angel. Marie's trial in Venice becomes an international sensation, transforming her from a private manipulator into a public spectacle. The prosecution presents her as a cold-blooded seductress who engineered Komarovsky's murder through psychological manipulation of the obsessed Prilikov. Witness after witness dismantles the carefully constructed image she had cultivated over the years. Former lovers testify to her systematic exploitation, creditors reveal her fraudulent schemes, and intimate letters are read aloud in court, exposing her calculated manipulation of men's emotions. The wealth and privilege that once protected her now serve as evidence against her, symbols of aristocratic decadence and moral corruption. As the trial progresses, Marie watches her identity fragment under public scrutiny. She is no longer a countess or even a person, but a character, the Black Angel, written by strangers and performed for their entertainment. Internally, she oscillates between defiance and piercing self-doubt, questioning whether she has indeed become the monster they describe. The chapter reveals a crucial twist. Documents from her father's estate show that her early manipulations were more extensive and calculated than even she had admitted to herself, blurring the line between survival and exploitation. The guilty verdict for complicity in murder marks not just legal judgment, but the complete destruction of her former identity. The courtroom resembled a theater more than a hall of justice, packed with spectators who had come not to witness legal proceedings, but to see the notorious Black Angel in chains. Marie sat in the defendant's dock, her beauty now a liability rather than an asset, every gesture scrutinized and interpreted as evidence of her guilt or innocence. She wore black silk. Some newspapers claimed this was a calculated choice to embrace her dark reputation, but in truth, it was simply the most respectable dress she owned after months of imprisonment. The presiding judge called the session to order as winter light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted indifferently above the human drama below. The prosecutor, a compact man with surgical precision in his voice, began his opening statement with devastating clarity. "Signori of the jury," he declared, "we are not here to judge a crime of passion. We are here to examine a pattern of destruction that spans years and countries. A woman who used aristocratic privilege as camouflage and beauty as a weapon of mass destruction." He methodically laid out Marie's biography as if it were an indictment: privileged birth, aristocratic education, disastrous marriage, trail of ruined lovers, mounting debts, and finally, orchestrated murder. In his telling, her entire life became a single, continuous conspiracy against the men who had the misfortune to love her. Documents were produced and read with damning effect. Letters from her father, dating back to 1899, revealed a pattern of financial manipulation that predated her supposed desperation. One particularly damaging piece of correspondence thanked her for her remarkable talent in securing favorable terms from creditors through personal charm. Another letter from a Viennese banker alluded to our charming negotiations over defaulted loans, suggesting Marie had been trading on her beauty for financial advantage far longer than anyone had realized. Listening to these revelations, Marie felt as if the courtroom floor were tilting beneath her. Those letters had once seemed like proof of filial devotion, evidence of her sacrifice for family honor. Now, under the harsh light of legal scrutiny, they appeared to document a systematic pattern of exploitation that began almost from the moment she learned to use her beauty as currency. Donat Prilikov took the stand on the trial's fifth day, a broken man who bore little resemblance to the passionate young attorney who had killed for love. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. "She told me," he said, his voice barely audible, eyes fixed on the floor, that Komarovsky was threatening her life. "She showed me bruises, wept in my arms, begged for protection. She never explicitly ordered me to kill him, but she made it clear that only his death would free her from torment. She said, if only someone loved me enough to save me." The prosecutor leaned forward like a predator sensing weakness. "And you, Signor Prilikov, decided that salvation required murder?" "Yes," Prilikov whispered, "because she had convinced me that without Komarovsky's death, she could not live. And without her, I could not exist." Marie wanted to stand, to scream that he was exaggerating, that he had brought his own delusions to their relationship, but fragments of memory betrayed her. The calculated tears, the strategic silences, the way she had allowed his imagination to race into dark territories she had only vaguely suggested. The morphine that still coursed through her system couldn't numb the growing realization that perhaps she had become exactly what they claimed. Former lovers paraded through the witness box over the following days, each adding another layer to the prosecution's portrait of systematic manipulation. A Viennese poet described her as a siren in perpetual distress, whose needs became more urgent whenever he tried to distance himself. A Russian prince recalled how she had persuaded him to guarantee substantial loans for a brief, harmless favor that had cost him thousands when she defaulted. Each individual story might have been dismissed as the bitterness of rejected suitors. Together, they formed a mosaic that was impossible to ignore. A pattern of seduction, exploitation, and abandonment that stretched across years and countries. Her defense attorney, a weary Italian who chain-smoked between sessions, tried desperately to counter the mounting evidence. "We are not judging personality flaws," he argued. "We are judging specific criminal acts. My client may be vain, perhaps manipulative, but she is not a murderer. At worst, she is guilty of poor judgment in matters of the heart." But the narrative of the Black Angel had taken hold in the public imagination. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations about her alleged supernatural powers, her ability to bewitch men into abandoning reason. She had become not just a defendant, but a symbol of aristocratic decadence, of feminine evil, of the dangerous power of uncontrolled beauty. The most devastating blow came not from witness testimony, but from documentary evidence. On the trial's 8th day, the prosecution introduced a cache of letters Marie had written to various lovers over the preceding years. Read aloud and stripped of context, they sounded like the calculated manipulations of a professional seductress. To one man, "You are my only hope in this cruel world, the single light in an ocean of darkness." To another, written the same week, "I am surrounded by those who would do anything to possess me, but none who truly understand my suffering." To a third, "I fear I cannot endure much longer without a protector strong enough to save me from those who would destroy me." The prosecutor's voice remained calm as he connected these communications to a broader pattern. "Gentlemen of the jury, observe the method, exaggerate the crisis, suggest impending doom, allow others to assume the risk while she reaps the reward. Whether seeking money or freedom from inconvenient relationships, the technique remains constant." Sitting in the defendant's dock, Marie closed her eyes against the weight of her own words turned into weapons against her. The courtroom's murmur receded as she confronted the uncomfortable truth that perhaps her survival strategies had evolved into something darker, more predatory than she had admitted even to herself. The most shocking revelation came during the trial's final week. A clerk from her father's estate presented documents that had been sealed until his death, revealing the true extent of Marie's early financial manipulations. She had not simply helped secure emergency credit for the family. She had systematically extracted money from multiple sources by presenting each creditor with slightly different versions of the family's financial crisis, always exaggerating the urgency to secure more favorable terms. One letter, written in her own hand when she was barely 20, coldly analyzed the psychological weaknesses of various potential investors in the family's future. Another document outlined a sophisticated scheme to play competing suitors against each other, extracting maximum financial benefit while maintaining plausible emotional distance. The prosecutor held up these papers like smoking guns. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a woman driven to desperate acts by circumstances. This is a criminal mind that learned early to view human emotion as a commodity to be harvested." Marie stared at those documents, evidence of calculations she had made so long ago they felt like another person's memories. Had she really been so cold, so systematic, even as a young woman? The morphine that had once provided clarity now seemed to fog her recollections, making it impossible to distinguish between survival and predation, between necessity and greed. On March 30th, 1903, the verdict was read. The courtroom fell silent as the judge pronounced the words that would define the rest of her life. Marie Tarnowska, found guilty of complicity in the murder of Count Pavel Komarovsky. The sentence blurred. 8 years imprisonment, loss of civil rights, permanent exile from Russian territory. Her defense attorney touched her arm. "It could have been worse," he whispered. "They could have demanded your execution." Marie almost laughed. Worse? She had once stood in a St. Petersburg ballroom with the world at her feet, inheritance secure, future sparkling with possibility. Now men who had never known the suffocating weight of aristocratic expectations debated how many years of her life should be spent behind bars. That night, in her cell, she lay awake, listening to water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Her mind walked backward through time, the Venetian pension, the St. Petersburg salons, the Polish countryside of her childhood. At each stage, she had done what seemed necessary, clever, inevitable. She had never paused long enough to ask where it all led. The transformation had not been sudden, she realized. It had been an unraveling that began the first time she discovered that a well-timed tear could move mountains of masculine resistance. Each successful manipulation had made the next one easier, more automatic, less questioned, until she had walked almost sleepwalking down a path paved with small compromises that led inevitably to catastrophe. Now, with no audience left to charm, no jury left to persuade, Marie faced the only person she had never tried to manipulate, the woman she had become. The Black Angel was not a supernatural creature of evil, but something far more terrifying, an ordinary person who had learned to treat human hearts like playing cards in a game where the stakes kept rising until someone had to die. Chapter 5. The Reckoning and Final Reflection. Marie serves her sentence in the women's prison of Trani, where the harsh reality of incarceration strips away the last vestiges of her aristocratic identity. Years pass in monotonous routine, her beauty fading, her morphine addiction gradually overcome through forced withdrawal. Within the prison walls, she is forced into equality with common criminals whose stories reveal that manipulation and desperation are not unique to palaces. Through work, routine, and unexpected moments of human connection, she confronts the full arc of her life, from gilded privilege to international scandal. Letters from the outside world dwindle as Europe is consumed by the Great War, placing her personal tragedy within the broader collapse of the aristocratic world that created her. A final revelation comes through documents showing that some of her early actions did temporarily save her family from ruin, complicating the narrative of pure selfishness. Released early due to poor health, she emerges into a world transformed by war and revolution, where her scandal has been forgotten amid greater tragedies. The chapter concludes with her death in obscurity in 1923, reflecting that wealth had promised invincibility, but ultimately bought only a more elaborate stage for human failure. Her story becomes a meditation on the corrupting nature of privilege and the thin line between survival and predation. The prison bell that marked the end of the Great War sounded no different from any other day's routine chimes. But Marie Tarnowska understood that the world beyond the walls had fundamentally changed. She had been imprisoned for 15 years, watching her beauty fade in the unforgiving Mediterranean sun, her body slowly purged of its morphine dependency through the brutal mercy of forced withdrawal. At 41, she bore little resemblance to the notorious Black Angel who had scandalized European society. The women's prison at Trani operated more like a convent than a penitentiary, run by nuns who believed in redemption through work and prayer. Marie had initially rebelled against the harsh routine: dawn prayers, manual labor, simple meals, evening silence, but gradually found unexpected solace in the predictability. There were no men to manipulate, no audiences to perform for, no complex schemes to maintain. For the first time since childhood, she existed simply as herself, stripped of titles, beauty, and the terrible burden of being desired. Her cellmates over the years had been thieves, prostitutes, women who had killed abusive husbands, peasants driven to desperate acts by poverty. Their stories chipped away at Marie's sense of uniqueness, revealing that manipulation and survival were universal human strategies, differing only in sophistication and scale. Lucia, imprisoned for poisoning her landlord who had tried to rape her daughter, possessed a cunning that rivaled any aristocrat's. Rosa, who had stabbed her husband after years of beatings, understood the mathematics of violence as clearly as any general. "Your crime," Rosa told her one evening as they mended prison uniforms by candlelight, "was thinking you were playing a different game than the rest of us. But we're all just trying to survive in a world that wants to destroy us. You just had prettier weapons." Letters from the outside world had dwindled to almost nothing. Her brother Jan wrote sporadically from Poland, his handwriting growing shakier with each correspondence. His final letter, dated September 1917, described the collapse of the Russian Empire, the execution of the Tsar's family, the disintegration of the aristocratic world that had shaped their lives. "The old world is ending," he wrote. "Perhaps it's fitting that you were among the first to fall. You were always ahead of your time, dear sister, even in destruction." In late 1918, a package arrived from a distant cousin, delayed by war and censorship, containing documents from her father's estate that had finally been processed. Among them were records that complicated her understanding of her own past. The early financial manipulations that had been used against her at trial had indeed saved the family from immediate ruin, preserving estates and livelihoods for hundreds of dependents. Her sister's dowry had been paid solely because of Marie's intervention with creditors. The family's servants had been pensioned rather than dismissed because of the breathing room her schemes had provided. These revelations brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the moral complexity she had spent years trying to avoid. She had not been purely a parasite, nor purely a victim. She had been what most people were, a mixture of motives, survival instincts, and choices made under pressure, some noble, some terrible, most simply human. The Spanish influenza pandemic that swept through Europe in 1918-1919 reached even the isolated prison at Trani. Marie, weakened by years of poor nutrition and the lingering effects of her addiction, contracted the disease but survived, though her lungs were permanently damaged. The prison doctor, a kind man who had treated her with respect despite her notoriety, recommended early release on medical grounds. "You're dying slowly," he told her matter-of-factly. "Prison is killing you by degrees. You have perhaps 2 years left if you remain here, maybe 5 if you're released to a healthier climate." On March 15, 1920, exactly 17 years after her trial began, Marie walked through the prison gates into a world she no longer recognized. Italy was struggling with economic collapse and political upheaval. The Austria-Hungary of her youth no longer existed. Russia had become the Soviet Union, her family's estates nationalized, her children grown and scattered to countries she had never seen. She made her way to Switzerland, using the last of her resources to secure a small room in a sanatorium near Lake Geneva. The other patients were mostly veterans of the war, men whose minds had been shattered by experiences that made her own trauma seem almost quaint. She found work translating letters for patients who could no longer write coherently. Her linguistic skills, one of the few gifts of her aristocratic education, finally serving a useful purpose. The remaining years of her life passed quietly, almost invisibly. The woman who had once commanded international headlines became just another aging exile, forgotten by a world consumed with new crises and different scandals. She read voraciously, wrote letters she never sent, and slowly came to terms with the person she had been and the choices she had made. Marie Tarnowska died on September 27, 1923, in the charity ward of a Geneva hospital. She was 46 years old. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but she had simply worn out, exhausted by the weight of carrying her past. A few European newspapers noted her passing with brief obituaries that reminded readers of scandals from 2 decades earlier, but most people had forgotten her entirely. In her final weeks, she had dictated a letter to a sympathetic nurse, though she never specified who should receive it. The letter was found among her few possessions after her death. "I have been called many things: seductress, manipulator, monster, victim. Perhaps I was all of these. Or perhaps I was simply a woman who learned too young that beauty was currency and survival required calculation. The world taught me that I was valuable only as an object of desire, then condemned me for using that lesson too well. I do not ask for forgiveness, because I am not certain I deserve it. But I hope that someday someone will understand that the Black Angel was not born in darkness. She was created by a world that offered women no other choice but to be consumed or to consume others. Wealth promised me everything: security, respect, power, love. In the end, it bought me only a more elaborate stage on which to fail. The gilded cage was still a cage, and all my schemes were simply different ways of rattling the bars. I was never truly free until I had nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect, nothing left to perform. If there is a lesson in my life, it is this: we are all capable of becoming monsters when we believe we have no other choice. The tragedy is not that I fell from grace. It is that I never understood what grace was until it was too late to choose it. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a Geneva cemetery, her funeral attended by no one but the priest who performed the service, and the gravediggers who covered her coffin with Swiss soil. The Black Angel had finally found the anonymity that had always eluded her in life, and perhaps in that anonymity she found the peace that wealth and beauty had never provided. The scandalous life of Marie Tarnowska ended not with drama, but with silence, leaving behind only questions about the price of beauty, the corruption of privilege, and the terrible mathematics of survival in a world that creates its own monsters and then condemns them for existing.